Welcome to our CVI Talks. We are very excited and thankful that you joined us today. I'm Mary Bro, the CVI Director at Sam Houston State University. Here at the Crime Victims Institute, we are committed to advancing research on victimization issues in Texas by conducting research to examine the impact of crime of all ages to promote a better understanding of victimization and assist victims of crime by giving them a voice. With that, it is our hope that the information presented in today's CVI Talks will be informative and helpful to your field of service. At this time, I will turn it over to our research assistants, Alyssa Linares and Taylor Robinson.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Linares. I received my bachelor's in victim studies from Sam Houston State University, and now I'm pursuing my master's in victim services management.
Hi, my name is Taylor Robinson. I received my bachelor's in criminal justice and minoring in forensic science and my master's in victim service management, and I'm now pursuing my doctorate in criminal justice.
Dr. Mulvey, can you explain your background as an associate professor for the Department of Criminal Justice Sciences at Illinois State University and working with veterans courts?
My name is Phillip Mulvey. I am an associate professor at Illinois State University, the Department of Criminal Justice Sciences. I originally started my research interests specifically in the interface between mental illness and crime. Within that, I have looked at other disenfranchised populations and how they come to the criminal justice system, and specifically their experiences of victimization as well as offending. One of those groups that I have over time begun to look at in depth are veterans, as well as other marginalized communities. Specifically looking to see how aspects of social control impact their lives and what happens to them across the life course as a result of that. I should note that I'm a life course researcher, so I am interested in learning about the experiences of these individuals and their symptomology and the turning points and trajectories they have across their life course that will ultimately impact outcomes for them. I should also note that, and I always like to say this when I'm speaking to different groups because they're often interested, I am not a veteran myself. I come from a veteran family. My father was a Vietnam era veteran. And so I can't speak to the experiences specifically of someone who has had military service themselves. However, I do have a lot of experiences being a member of a military family and some of the things that happen as a result of that and some of the experiences around that. I should also note that what I say today and in my discussion of veterans in general are just my personal views and my experience in working with veterans, and they're not those necessarily of veterans or all veterans families in general, and that there are often varied experiences across the life course for different groups and for individuals. So in way of saying that, and looking at the interface between mental illness and criminal justice, I eventually started studying veterans, specifically because so many veterans and people who have had military service do experience mental illness later after their military service, or because of experiences of trauma during military service, become involved in the criminal justice system. And that's originally how I became interested in veterans courts as well, which I'll speak to more later in the interview.
Dr. Smith, can you explain your background as a data analyst for the research and development under the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and your background working with the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston?
So I think, as with anything, we have to take a little bit further back to understand me and why I research what I research and why I'm so passionate about this subject. So in 2006, I graduated high school and enlisted in the United States Army. I spent 6 years on active duty as a human intelligence collector for the United States Army. And this included multiple deployments to Afghanistan. Then, after leaving active duty, I transferred into the National Guard, and in 2012, as a National Guardsman, started school in the Criminal Justice and Criminology program at Arizona State University. Now, eventually, this led me to pursue my master's degree in criminal justice and criminology at Arizona State. During this time, I had the unique opportunity to do research in the Correctional Officer Training Academy for the Arizona Department of Corrections, as well as teach within several prison units that were ran by the Arizona Department of Corrections. It was at this time that I really became interested in veterans in the criminal justice system, and that includes both clients and custodians within the system. It became apparent to me through reading the research and just interacting with the people that I did that, veterans are intrinsically different in some ways than the general populations we're dealing with and discussing in criminal justice research. So fast forward a few years at Sam Houston State University, and I began pursuing my own research agenda and have just generally kind of focused this on special interest populations within correctional settings. And of course, the primary special interest population I'm interested in are veterans, because I have this shared experience with this population. And not only can I bridge the academic knowledge that is the culmination of my education, but I can also import this rich experience I have and this knowledge I have accumulated over 12 years of military service myself. And so this has really brought me to question some of the prevailing paradigms of the veterans research within criminal justice, including how we measure things in veterans research and why we measure some things and not other things. And I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. It's also important to note that I now work in a position with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and my primary function there is to generate statistical reports as well as research reports based on various phenomena that the agency needs to know more about. As of now, this is focused on topics ranging from how we better retain correctional officers to how we interrupt self-injurious behaviors among those incarcerated. And in the future, we'll also be focusing on the quality and the results of correctional programming for veterans within our system.
Dr. Mulvey, when we use the term veteran, who are we referring to?
That's a really good question, and it actually varies depending on who you talk to in some circles. For instance, the the Veterans Affairs has a very specific guideline by what they consider a veteran and who's eligible for VA services. In my own research, I consider anyone who has went to basic training and graduated basic training as a veteran. And when I'm doing interviews or surveys with, quote, veterans, that is the specific conceptualization that I personally use.
Dr. Smith, can you define veteran victimization or offending? And do you have any statistics related to this type of crime?
Yeah, so veteran victimization and offending isn't definitionally unique to veterans. They're just these unique situations, whereas one party in this victim offender dyad is a veteran of the United States Armed Forces. And that's relatively straightforward, right? However, it's important to note that the extending of offending among veterans isn't exactly straightforward or clear. That is to say, we don't really keep track of who is offending in the United States with fine enough detail to say, hey, this proportion of our population of offenders are veterans. But here's what we do know. In 2018, around 7% of the total US population were considered military veterans. And similarly, around 8% of the correctional population were veterans. And as you can see, similar statistics over the preceding decade or so. And generally, the gap between veteran representation and the general public and correctional custody is shrinking. However, it's important to note that a lot of good academics have placed serious doubts on the veracity of our ability to count veterans in prison and jail, suggesting that some states have a substantial veteran population in correctional custody, which is not counted as such. This is all to say we have to take our knowledge of veteran offending with a grain of salt, because it might be the case that we're actually missing a lot of veterans. But what we can say of the veterans in the data, that veterans who are incarcerated are more likely than non-veterans to have been convicted of serious violent offenses and offenses of a sexual nature. In fact, this is kind of the basis for most veterans' crime theory. Now, If we look past the population of incarcerated veterans to those within veterans treatment courts or other problem-solving courts, we see that many veterans also engage in illicit substance use or property offending, and many are also in violation of what are typically called or considered vagrancy laws. And that's just being homeless is unfortunately still a crime in some jurisdictions. And so perhaps it's not surprising as well that also over half of those veterans in the criminal justice system, to include those in veterans treatment courts and prisons, have some sort of mental health issue. So these statistics don't only fit with the long-standing criminological theory and general patterning of crimes which bring veterans to prison or treatment courts, but is also demonstrative of a phenomenon that we see in other criminal justice involved populations. That is, often untreated mental health issues lead to criminal justice involvement in one way or another. And so individuals with mental health issues are especially vulnerable to being crime victims. We might expect veterans with mental health issues to similarly be vulnerable to being victims of crime. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of national level data on this that I'm aware of. And it could be because I don't study victimization. So please don't take this as minimizing your work if you're someone who does. But that being said, we can possibly take a quick glimpse at the NCVS to help us understand the general national level trend of veteran victimization. Now, I know the NCVS is limited in some respects, but we can still learn quite a bit from it. For instance, the NCVS tracked veteran status for a few years, I think 2015 to 2019, right? And in this time period, they regularly showed that veterans are a little less likely than non-veterans to experience violent victimization, but that these differences were so small as to not be statistically significant. And they show that the rate of violent victimization for veterans is around 20 per 100,000. So there's some evidence that veterans experience more serious victimization at levels which are similar to the general public. This, of course, is a tricky assumption to make because the fact is that there's probably lots of underreporting happening, specifically among the veteran population. I'm sure that's something we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Dr. Mulvey, as someone who interacts with veterans and oversees the veterans courts, what do you see within this arena as far as adjudication and treatment?
I should first note that I do interact regularly with veterans courts, but I don't oversee specifically any aspects of the veterans courts. Normally what the role I serve is to help evaluate those courts through a program evaluations, also through process or outcome evaluations. So I do just want to note that normally it is overseen by a judge or normally it's overseen by a judge, and that's the official in charge of the veterans court. As far as adjudication and treatment are concerned, as Dr. Smith noted, about 8% of the criminal justice system, roughly, are veterans or individuals who have had military experience. So they are frequent within our criminal justice system. And there's a variety of offenses that individuals who have had military experience commit. In just the same way, there are individuals in the general public, a variety of offenses that they commit on a regular basis. That noted, oftentimes as a result of military experience, individuals in the military will have specific risk or needs. For instance, substance use is a common example of that, as is post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll speak to more later. In addition, many individuals who have military service or veterans have specific treatment needs around post-traumatic stress, as I mentioned, but also other common mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and so forth. Substance use and abuse is a common concern among military populations, often as a result of things they've experienced within the military or the military culture in general. Trauma is also a great concern as far as treatment is concerned for these individuals. We often think about combat veterans, and we should, as experiencing a lot of trauma. However, individuals who are in the military who are not in combat also experience trauma. which I'll speak to more later in the podcast as well. So it's important to consider things that might exist for military personnel that can be traumatic, that aren't necessarily combat as well, and how that might impact their later offending and victimization.
I think Dr. Mulvey's discussion of expanding past combat and post-traumatic stress disorder is kind of the primary focus of veterans treatment and is instrumentally important. And so to expand upon that, my doctoral dissertation focused on examining how deployments themselves can be stressful events that have a negative physiological and social consequences that may result in poor mental health outcomes or substance use and subsequently criminal offending. I think it's important to note too that Dr. Mulvey and I are not alone in this endeavor. While much of the veterans literature, especially in criminology, focuses on combat, even the military themselves recognize that stress on deployments or stress during training exercise or through the course of daily duties in the United States may have profound physiological and social consequences that result in these negative outcomes we're interested in. I think probably the primary factors with which the military is concerned with tend to be operational stress reactions and combat stress reactions. It's important to note these operational stress reactions can take place in the field while someone's training to go on a deployment. They can take place in pre-deployment training miles away from your home station while you're living in tents and fighting positions for a month or two at a time. And they can also occur while you're on a deployment and just not experiencing combat. And to this point, it's important to note that most veterans, even those who've deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq and even Vietnam, did not experience combat the way we think about it and the way Hollywood portrays it. In fact, only about half of those who deploy now experience combat, and that figure is in a substantial increase from those who deployed in the Second World War and Vietnam. And so this kind of all is taken together to show that combat shouldn't necessarily be our focus. And there's lots of stuff that we know has important physiological consequences, which can later translate into poor health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes, and criminal justice involvement.
Just to piggyback on what Dr. Smith said as well, I didn't mention in the beginning, but I'm actually trained as a clinician, and that's how my work started before I was ever an academic. And speaking specifically in post-traumatic stress and the individuals I've interacted with and completed therapy with, the two individuals I've seen with the worst post-traumatic stress disorder, one was vicarious trauma through a friend, a best friend in the military who had committed suicide. And the second was actually an accident that happened stateside during a military exercise. So I think this is, again, piggybacking exactly off of what Dr. Smith said. It's important to understand in the general public, individuals often assume that post-traumatic stress is just about combat experience. And it is, but it has much more than just combat as a basis.
I also think it's important to address the so-called, elephant in the room, right? In recent years, military sexual trauma, or MST, has been highlighted in the news and research. It's important to note that we don't know a lot about sexual victimization and sexual trauma in the military, but some of the developing research, including that which is happening at the direction of the federal government, has demonstrated that both men and women in uniform are more likely to experience some sort of sexual victimization, both prior to their military service and during their military service, than peers who are matched across a variety of characteristics, to include socioeconomic status, age, gender, and race. So what this shows us is that there's an inherent risk, not only in selection, but in the military experience itself, which may lead to other forms of trauma, which are very important where victimization is concerned, and even potentially the victim offender overlap.
Dr. Smith, what are some of the barriers that you see that affect veterans when reporting crimes against them, or how does their veteran status affect the reporting rate?
I think we'd be really remiss here if we didn't focus on, or at least discuss, culture when we talk about victimization and reporting in the military or even among veterans. It's important that people listening understand that the military recruitment process is oriented in such a manner that they're really trying to pull in an individual who has a certain set of values, a certain set of beliefs, and has a certain set of abilities. Now, generally, this makes sense, right? We want people who can follow orders, but can think under stress, who are self-sufficient, and willing to do harm to other people. That's the purpose of the military. We need that. However, in selecting these individuals or individuals who can be molded into those individuals through training, we create a certain type of environment. And it's my opinion that part of the military administration and those at higher levels, part of their job is really balancing, we want what you would call hatchet men, right? We want men and women who are willing to jump out of planes and do extreme violence on people. But we also want them to not do extreme violence on people who don't deserve it. And we don't want them to do extreme violence on each other. And so what this creates is kind of this culture or this atmosphere, which could probably easily be described as hypermasculine, I think. And so one of those core tenets I was talking about, right, is that big, manly man, or even a female soldier like that, just big, strong person who's self-sufficient, who doesn't need help from anybody because that's weakness and is there to, kick rocks and accomplish the mission. And so the general purpose, right, is to recruit these people who are these, hyper masculine individuals who are strong and confident and there to complete the mission and don't need help from anyone. So what this does is permeates the cultural fabric. And as this culture proliferates, then you get these core tenets, which might not even be central to the military value system. One of those focuses on self-sufficiency and determination insofar as individuals are encouraged, not to go to sick call, to seek out mental health treatment, and not to, as we'd say, snitch on individuals who've done some harm towards them. And so you have this culture that is essentially established where reporting victimization of a crime is looked down upon. Instead, the culture ascribes that individuals should address that victimization themselves. And typically we see that through violence. If someone steals out of your barracks room, what do? You wait till that Friday night while they're at a party and you go smack them around and take your stuff back. And this seems a little hedonistic and like, hyper masculine. But to those on the inside, it makes this sort of cold, calculating sense, right? This is just the rule. This is what you do. It's what it's expected of you. And so to expect that this culture doesn't transfer with individuals to the outside would maybe be a little naive. There are individuals who are immersed in this culture for 2 years or 20 years and become veterans, right, after they depart from the military. And it's, we're not hitting a race on their value system, right? We're just adding to it as they get exposure outside of the military. And this is essentially what I suspect forms the primary barrier to reporting victimization among veterans. Now, it's also important to note that there are a lot of veterans who are additionally members of other vulnerable populations, as I'm sure Dr. Mulvey would like to attest to and talk more of in a second. Many veterans are also members of other vulnerable populations, and this can include anyone from people who are homeless to people who are sex workers, to folks who are just engaged in substance use. And so if someone who's otherwise not engaging in offending besides some recreational substance use is then victimized while engaging in that substance use, such as consuming marijuana, they're probably not going to report to the police that someone beat them up and stole their stuff while they were smoking a joint, right? This makes sense, right? Because there's the potential for them to be targeted, harassed by the police. In some cases, we see that concern among homeless veterans, but also if they're already engaged in a crime, there's the fear that instead of being helped with their victimization, they're going to be prosecuted in one way or another.
So in response to Dr. Smith's discussion about victimization and hypermasculinity, I think it's important to note, and I am in a complete agreement with what he said, I think it's important to note that originally in life course theory, there was the argument that the military served as a protective factor, this factor that would eventually lead to desistance by training individuals into pro-social behavior. And Sampson and Lobb, among others, have argued in depth about that topic. Other research has argued that there's this concern over a selection bias into the military. And specifically speaking to what Dr. Smith was discussing about hypermasculinity, there's an argument that some individuals self-select into the military, that in the military, we see these things as beneficial to being a, quote, good soldier. The problem with that, or the consequence of that, is that some of these skill sets are also what makes someone more likely to commit a crime. And as a result of that, it's important to discuss, or at least consider in this discussion, how many individuals actually enter the criminal justice system. And we're always going to enter the criminal justice system, but the military served as a temporary knifing off point from that, but not a permanent one.
Dr. Mulvey, what are some prevention strategies to reduce veteran victimization and offending?
I would argue that there are many. First is better service utilization and availability. Dr. Smith spoke earlier about some of the aspects that might lead someone not to report a victimization. And I think this culture that exists within the military, and I should be able to handle things on my own, results often in individuals not seeking help when they need it, or the fear that if they seek out help, they're going to be considered weak or not a good soldier. And so taking away the stigma around just utilization and availability around these services, I think is very important. I think more opportunities for support and discussion around support are very important, that we take out the stigma involved in utilizing a lot of these services. And some of that, I believe, in my opinion, is on the military as well, to discuss these things in greater detail and to foster an environment where individuals are able to speak more to these problems and to get support. Now, that noted, there are amazing services that are available around hotlines and around other services that individuals can utilize, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, substance abuse treatment, and so forth. I think it's also important that we make all of these services widely available to as many veterans as we can, because the truth of the matter is there are several veterans that are not eligible for VA services that are in desperate need of things like substance abuse treatment, of post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, and so forth. I think it's also important that we consider less stigma, especially around suicide and suicidal behavior and suicidal ideation among the public in general, but especially among veterans. We have a national crisis on our hands about veteran suicide and suicidality. I think we also need better screening into the military, specifically in regard to what Dr. Smith and I were discussing earlier in the interview about some individuals might already be predisposed to suffer or have maladaptive consequences as a result of their military service and or the things that they see and do in the military. Exit services leaving the military, I often hear from individuals I do research with, need to be better, and that they need to have more services around readjusting back into general society or back into the general public. Many veterans will tell me that the military trained them how to be a great soldier, but did not untrain them on any of those skills that to be a good citizen after leaving the military. So better consideration of coping strategies for these veterans as they leave the military, I think, is very important as well. And finally, there's the aspect of moral injury, which goes beyond specifically thinking just about post-traumatic stress disorder, but about the philosophical and moral wounds as a result of being in the military and or warfare, which I'll speak to more in one of your later questions.
If I can just clarify for some of our listeners out there, Dr. Mulvey was talking about screening, right? In the military, maybe is not the person to do its own screening after potentially traumatic events. What comes to mind for me in particular is post-deployment screening. And as of when I got off of active duty in 2012, it was something everybody experienced the same week they come home from a deployment in a combat zone, such as Iraq or Afghanistan. And I can very vividly remember being a 21-year-old soldier after being attached to special operations for a year, having witnessed probably over 100 firefights, after having killed individuals in combat, after seeing civilians, enemies, and friends killed in combat. I was asked simply if I had ever experienced or seen someone killed, injured, or dead who was an ally, enemy, or civilian. If you know much about that, or if you recognize that measure, that's directly from the Ad Health survey. And then I was asked if I needed psychological help. And I was a 21-year-old who just got done deploying as an attachment to Army Special Forces on the Special Forces team. Do you believe I thought I needed help? No, absolutely not. Did I need help? Did I need mental health treatment after that as a course of just response to the high levels of trauma I just experienced for a year in Afghanistan? Absolutely. But you know what the medical practitioner did when I said I didn't need help? They checked the box, they put it in a system, they sent me to the next station to go get my blood draws from deployment. And so here's a problem of carrots and sticks, right? It doesn't benefit the military in the short term to provide a lot of mental health treatment for soldiers who are experiencing trauma. And when budgets are based off of yearly accruals, believe me, they're only thinking of the short term. So the problem here is people who are doing these mental health evaluations cannot be employed or attached to the military or Department of Defense in any manner. We have to have outside mental health reviews for soldiers coming back from overseas. Because at the end of the day, if that person's paycheck is cut by the DoD, there are processes in place which, to one degree or another, probably encourage them to just check boxes and move people through.
To piggyback off of what Dr. Smith just said, and again, this is anecdotal evidence, but I have experienced in the form of interviewing veterans or in therapy, similar situations where veterans will tell me that they went and tried to seek out treatment through the military. And when they were able to receive it, that often they felt that they were judged and or that the person who was providing the treatment to them was an arm of the government or the military, as opposed to being someone with their psychological or health needs most in consideration. And so again, that's anecdotal things that I've heard, and I can't speak to it as an overall statistic. But that noted, I think it's important that we consider that as well, that people's feelings about whether or not they can trust the mental health provider if they are specifically an employee of the United States military as well.
I think it's also very, very important to understand that who's providing service doesn't just affect service utilization. Like Dr. Mulvey said, the way individuals, peers, and the cultural dynamic of the military units they're in likely shape whether or not they're going to use mental health services after experiencing a traumatic event. Now, I can't speak to whether this program or this mindset is ongoing in active duty, but as of the time frame I got out of active duty in the Army, which was around 2012, leaders were starting to do something which I believe is pretty novel, in an ingenious way of encouraging soldiers to seek out mental health treatment and physical health treatment when necessary and needed. And that was tying treatment back to the mission and mission readiness. So this is something for you practitioners to consider, right? So we know the military is this kind of hyper masculine culture where you have young 18-year-old soldiers who have a piece of rebar sticking out of their leg and they wouldn't want to go to the medic or sick call, let alone if they experienced some sort of psychological trauma. So leaders were tying that to the mission, and they were telling guys, hey, if your leg's messed up, if your body's not working, if your mind is messed up, this doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're weak to experience trauma, but it does mean you have to get it sorted out. And they said in those uncertain terms many times, if you don't seek out help for those mental health issues you are experiencing, you might as well be putting bullets in the enemy's guns, because you're not going to be mission effective. You're not going to be a good partner to the other soldiers downrange, and you're going to be a liability. And so they're taking this overall concept of mission readiness and tying it to ways to encourage young men and women to seek out mental health and physical health treatment. I think this was a really ingenious way to do it. The big question is this strategy still in play? Is it globalized across branches or not?
So Dr. Smith, I know we have touched on this topic a little bit, but what are some of the common mental health issues that veterans face outside of PTSD?
Dr. Mulvey, as a clinician, can probably speak to this a little bit better than me, but general anxiety and depressive disorders are probably going to be your big two that you see most common among veterans. And it's important to note that generalized anxiety and depressive disorders typically load on PTSD, meaning they're generally somewhat correlated. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Mulvey, but generally, if you have PTSD, you have a more generalized co-occurring disorder to some degree. Additionally, I believe there is some evidence that veterans do disproportionately suffer from schizoaffective and bipolar personality type disorders to varying degrees. And I'm sure Dr. Mulvey can correct me there or speak more on it. But I also think it's important that there are also experiences which shape how veterans react to their mental health that occur before and during the military as well. Specifically, adverse childhood events or ACEs, which there's a broad variety of experiences those can encompass, but it's just important to note that childhood victimization likely plays a large part in individuals' responses to military trauma and then responses to subsequent mental illnesses that are a result of that trauma.
Dr. Mulvey, what is veterans' mental health victimization and what are risk factors associated?
Throughout our discussion today, Dr. Smith has mentioned a few times this idea of the victim-offender overlap. And I think it's really important as someone who studies the victim-offender overlap to understand that for many individuals in the criminal justice system, it's not an either-or type of situation. Most offenders are also victims. Most offenders have experienced victimization in their lives, and that could be a variety of different things. The same is true for most veterans who are offenders. They've also been victimized. Some of those are what we consider more, quote, traditional types of victimization, and others of those are less known in the general public. So for instance, sexual assault is a problem in the United States military. And many veterans and military personnel, especially female, but also male, are sexually assaulted and or sexually harassed or experience sexual violence at some point while they're in the military. Another important thing to consider is what Goffman, the well-known sociologist, would refer to as the military is a total institution. And this is the idea that individuals are trained in a very specific way, and they are not to question that training in any type of way. And as a result of that, that can create inherent forms of victimization. And what I mean by that, and as we've discussed already today, is this idea that you're trained to be specifically a soldier, and you're not trained to have specific questions or feelings or responses about that beyond what the military asked you, and that is to be a good soldier. This can create all sorts of victimization experiences that we think of less as victimization experience. I mentioned earlier that I'd talk about moral injury. This is a perfect example. Now, there's no set definition of moral injury, and in fact, many experts disagree, and the United States military also, some branches will disagree with this terminology. However, essentially moral injury is this idea that some soldiers or some veterans will suffer psychologically as a result of things they have experienced and or witnessed while they're in the military. It's different than post-traumatic stress disorder in the sense that post-traumatic stress disorder is a physical response. Things like hypervigilance, nightmares. These are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. A moral injury is more the idea behind the psychological consequence that I may have killed people, or I may have killed innocent children, or I may have killed a fellow soldier of mine through friendly fire, among many other examples. And this is a victimization experience in the sense that you were trained by the United States military in order to be a soldier. And so as a result of that, individuals who experience trauma and or moral injury in the military can have specific and detrimental victimization experiences. Finally, and I think very importantly, myself being one of these individuals, is that it's important to also consider the victimization of families and military families. That victimization goes just beyond what happens with the veteran. For instance, his or her children might be victimized greatly as a result of their military service in a secondary way. And this is of no fault of the veteran, of course, but many of the common occurrences that happen with some military individuals after they leave service, whether that be substance abuse, domestic violence, criminogenic risk and need, can also impact the children, spouses, and family members in ways that are quite victimizing to them.
I think Dr. Mulvey brings up a very important point about moral injury in an area which is just woefully understudied. But I would challenge anybody who disagrees with moral injury being a thing is to think back to one of their friends who has deployed in support of the global war on terror to Afghanistan. The chances are you know somebody. Just think generally about their behavior the week we pulled out of Afghanistan earlier this year. That should be your answer there if moral injury exists. I think going back specifically to the Vietnam War, we can see a lot of amounts of evidence among Vietnam veterans that the way we left the war resulted in a moral injury to those service members who had participated. And so it's just instrumentally important to understand these phenomena and how they influence our veterans, because they can be these small events that Dr. Mulvey spoke about, like combat, a firefight, a misplaced rifle round that happens in an instant. Or it can be the result of carefully planned out policy to withdraw our troops from a country after, we had soldiers there for decades, and when our soldiers are also forecasting negative consequences of us pulling out like human rights violations. And so my question or challenge to researchers who want to examine moral injuries are also, how do those affect service utilization? Are soldiers who are now veterans and ashamed of the way the US pulled out of a country or ended a conflict, are they more or less likely to utilize VA services or even other non-VA services for mental health treatment, substance use treatment? We really don't know. There's not really much research in this area.
Dr. Smith, what events or activities do you notice affect service members' mental health the most?
Wow, this is a really good question. So if you go through the veterans literature in the criminological space, there's not going to be any doubt in your mind, right? Combat, 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 and more combat. The criminological literature tells you that combat influences subsequent mental health through trauma, and then substance use, which then transfers into substance use related or non-substance use related offending. And so that's kind of generally what we'd also see imported from Edward Kantian's self-medication hypothesis. Or if you take a more developmental approach, you might subscribe to Archer and Gartner's violent veteran model, right? Which is essentially the military conditions you to do violence and normalizes violence. So while that doesn't necessarily result in poor mental health outcomes, it results in veterans selecting violence from their toolbox to deal with social situations much more frequently. And this has been the focus of our literature since like 1948, when Dr. Betty Rosenbaum did one of what I believe is the first modern veterans and crime studies. All that's to say, though, when it comes to associating combat with offending, we might be missing the mark a little bit. And so, shameless plug for my own dissertation, we find that when we control for things such as deployments, which aren't traditionally looked at in path modeling, we see that actually combat, it has a small to moderate effect, just like deployments do. And mental health problems have a small to moderate effect on offending. But substance use has this relatively huge effect on offending. Now you're like, Wesley, back up though. What's the effect of combat on mental health? And it's moderate. It's moderate in these models. But the fact of the matter is, this modeling suggests, alongside calls from numerous academics, right, that focusing primarily on combat is doing a disservice, not only to our research, but our veterans as well. And this is to say, things like substance use, which aren't necessarily intrinsically tied to experiencing combat, are the large drivers of veteran offending. Yes, combat and deployments are important, but they're not necessarily these linchpin events that completely and totally influence every aspect of veterans' lives for the rest of their lives. It turns out these more normative factors like, engaging in substance use or losing your home or getting a divorce, right? These things that have generally large effects for normal people who aren't veterans on the outside are probably really meaningful for veterans too, potentially even more than service-related factors.
Dr. Mulvey, how have current events such as the pandemic and social unrest affected veterans' mental health?
So I think the one word I could say to best describe this would be hypervigilance. As a part of being hyperly vigilant, as many soldiers are as a result of their training when they enter the military and during their experiences in the military, I think that any form of societal unrest can then impact them. But I think one valuable takeaway point from our discussion today, too, is that veterans are not a monolithic population here, and that all veteran experiences are unique. And some veterans will react in one way while others will react in another way. So beyond just the pandemic, which I think has impacted all our mental health, and especially individuals who are first responders. And I would argue that veterans are first responders. I mean, when I went and received both of my COVID vaccinations, it was run by my local ROTC, right? And so veterans were the people there giving out the vaccinations and so forth with the help of local healthcare officials. So I think those things are important, but also to consider other aspects of social unrest too. So for instance, violence at the border is a traumatic experience for some veterans that they would react to in a certain way. And I think these things are important to consider in the trauma response and hypervigilance around them. But I think what gets looked at so less often are all the other aspects of triggers and trauma responses for veterans that happen every single day that we don't think about in the way that we think about things like societal unrest. So for instance, just riding the bus can be an immensely triggering event for an individual who is hypervigilant as a result of their military service and what they saw and had to do. Or for instance, at sporting events, we love to stand and cheer and clap for veterans at sporting events. We'll often have them as guest captain at football games, or they will start the siren before the initial kickoff and so forth. What we don't often understand as the general public, that in our celebration of these things, that they can be quite traumatic events for veterans who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or just having trauma responses in general as a result of things they may have saw or did during the military. I think perhaps one of the biggest examples of that would be 4th of July fireworks and the amount of veterans I speak to on a regular basis that hate the 4th of July, not for anything it stands for, other than about how triggered they are by fireworks and the events around holidays and other daily activities that can produce a trauma response, be it be about noise and so forth. So I think it's important that we consider large societal unrest, and that absolutely is a triggering event for many individuals who are veterans. But also even in day-to-day interactions and being able to go to a store or ride a bus or sit in a football stadium are also important things for us to consider and about how it might be a traumatic event for a veteran.
Dr. Smith, how can military personnel practice self-care to try to lessen the mental health impact of being in the field?
This is a pretty tough question because self-care can be pretty individualistic in nature. Also, the field is going to look different for an infantryman who's at a 30-day field training exercise versus an intelligence analyst who's at the same exercise, or even when we consider combat and deployments, right? At combat time, where self-care is instrumentally important, looks fundamentally different for someone at a small combat outpost versus a big base like Bagram Airfield. And so I believe it's very important for service members to plan for self-care before they go to training in the field or to a combat environment when they deploy. Considering that, they need to take account of what they're able to do for self-care. I know a lot of young soldiers, if they're listening to this, would say, Dr. Smith, we're going to a field training exercise in, North Fort Hood for a month. We don't get self-care. We're going to be going 24/7 or sleeping. And that's a good point, but it doesn't mean that you can't give yourself little micro doses of self-care. Are you religious? Bring a field Bible out. Are you a bookworm? Bring a book you enjoy out. Those are some big ones we saw a lot over there. Are you one of those workout nuts? That's cool. You got 5 minutes of downtime, do some push-ups or sit-ups or something, not because you're getting in trouble, but because you enjoy it. Find out what your activities are that burn off stress particularly. And that's because we look at the literature, right? We see the physiological consequences of stress are often tied to mental health outcomes. So find a way to burn off that stress. Hey, are you going to Afghanistan or Iraq or now, the Philippines or Africa for a year? Okay, make sure you've got some sort of self-care options available. I don't, if it's reading materials, if it's some sort of game system you can share with other soldiers, if you've got if it's some sort of game system you can share with other soldiers if you have electricity, if it's making sure you use your weekly MWR time to call your family, or even maintaining a Facebook or Instagram account if you're allowed to at your facility so you can keep in close contact with friends and loved ones. The key focus here is that soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they all need to strategize on how they are going to relieve stress on their deployments. I give you a lot of examples of what I think that looks like for me and veterans of my generation. The fact is, none of that really matters, because you're going to be going into a unique experience and you're going to have unique self and experience driven needs. And so what this translates into for chain of command, if you are in charge of young service members going overseas, is you need to afford them the time for self-care, and you need to make sure they're using it. How sad would it be if leadership didn't take opportunities to ensure their soldiers were conducting 15, 20 minutes of self-care a day, no matter what that looked like? If that 15, 20 minutes were to relieve enough stress to where soldiers transitioning out of that unit don't have debilitating PTSD or chronic anxiety and depressive disorder. I'm not saying self-care is going to be a problem solver for everything, but the cumulative effects of those 15 minutes every day or that hour every week might be very meaningful for those soldiers. And so we're not just talking about improving people's lives, but also contributing to our ability to successfully execute the mission of our branches of service. And considering that, leaders should be keeping self-care in mind, knowing that it serves that twofold purpose.
Dr. Mulvey, how can the community help service members during their transition back into the civilian lifestyle?
So that's a really important but also difficult question to answer. Philosophically, I think that we need to be constantly aware of these individuals' sacrifice. And I think it's important to consider that at some points, it becomes so commonplace just to say things like, thank you for your service, and so forth, that we lose all meaning behind what those terms mean. It's just like how we go through a day and say, I hope you have a good day, or have a good day. We don't even think anything of it, right? So I think it's especially important for a CVI talk, right? And to consider about victimization and so forth, that we really try to think about this in an empathetic way. That we will never, unless you're a veteran yourself, specifically be able to understand every situation that individual has gone through. Or if you're not a member of a veteran's family, being able to understand what that experience is like. That noted, we can do our best to develop a sense of empathy, to try to put ourselves in their shoes or in this person's shoes, to better understand specifically their experience, or at least try to relate in any way that we can. So I think that's really important. I think it's also important to understand that no experience is uniform, and where some veterans will excel, others may have a maladaptive outcome as a result of their military service, or partially because of their military service. So to be able to help them in any way that we can is important, whether that be something that's as simple as talking to them if they need someone to talk to, helping them out with some task they may need done, or any other way that we can think of in order to support individuals who have had military service. From a legislative standpoint and from a more practical standpoint, I personally think that we should push any policy that empowers our ability to assist veterans in any way we can, whether that's easier access to resources, whether that be treatment or healthcare or certain specific types of therapy, and to do whatever we can continue to do to push legislation that will help these individuals in any way we can. From a very practical standpoint on things like healthcare or specific health services, to more of a empathetic standpoint or philosophical one, and that we try to be good community members and good neighbors to these individuals, even if we can't specifically understand every event that they've gone through or every experience that they've witnessed.
Dr. Smith, are there any resources for veterans to access if they're seeking mental health professionals?
Absolutely. One of the great expansions of our military and kind of military complex over the last several decades has been the expansion of services that military service members and veterans can action. And so I've got to say for veterans out there listening or someone who's trying to get help for a veteran, it's important to know that the Veterans Administration, the VA webpage, their hotline is probably going to be one of the best starting points. Now, no, not all veterans want to action VA resources, or maybe they're not always appropriate, or maybe they don't qualify. And that's okay. First and foremost, if you are or know a veteran who's going through some tough times, who has suicidal thoughts or is contemplating attempting suicide, you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. And they actually have a veterans subline, which I believe runs through and is staffed through the VA, so that you can talk to someone with similar experiences and someone who's gone through some of the things you've gone through. That being said, if you're looking for more generalized mental health resources, Military One Source and the National Veterans Foundation both maintain call lines and websites, which will help veterans action a wide variety of different resources, including mental health resources. And additionally, I know it's not intrinsically tied to mental health, but there are a lot of resources out there for homeless veterans. And we know homelessness is a real problem among our community members, right? So that being said, I'm providing here a number for the National Homelessness Hotline. And if you call the homelessness hotline, there is a VA sub number you can dial into, and they can get you help actioning some homelessness resources specifically for veterans.
In following up with what Dr. Smith just said, I think from a research standpoint, it's very important that we continue to do research on programming and to do better research on programming. For instance, we should always be asking veterans what they need and what would be helpful to them. And so often in the research, we don't do that. We don't ask them about their narrative experience and what we can actually do to help them. So for instance, on things like suicide and suicide risk, which we know is a national crisis for veterans, speaking to them specifically about what we might possibly be able to do in order to help them and to hear about their experience in order to design these programs is very, very important to better service and to better serve these individuals who have served us as United States military personnel.
Dr. Mulvey, what do you plan on doing as far as future research involving veterans and their mental health?
Well, first I should say that I didn't plant this question based on my last response, but it just kind of authentically, we went there in the discussion. But all of my research is tied to the veteran experience, learning about their narrative experience and that, whether that be through victimization, whether that be through their offending experience, or whether it just be about their life course outcomes and the explanation and story of their lives. I think it's very important that we hear those stories and that we share them. Specifically, and as we've discussed throughout the podcast, moral injury is one area that I'm quite interested in, and I think that we have understudied, that there's a lot of disagreement about, that, as Dr. Smith has said, however, and I agree, definitely exist. And it's important that we research and continue to understand in better ways these injuries to the soul and these moral aspects of military service and all the things that veterans see and witness that can impact their later life outcomes. Also, from a very practical standpoint, veterans have many of the same socioeconomic problems that many of the rest of us do. And that might be finding employment or finding affordable housing or help with childcare and so forth. I think it's very important that every veteran that we have discussed today, or at least most of them, have volunteered for this service. And as a result, we should do everything we possibly can to help them after they leave military service. So a lot of my future research is focused on other aspects beyond just the psychological ones that we need to consider for veterans, whether that be housing or childcare or healthcare, et cetera, et cetera.
Dr. Smith, what are your plans for future research for veterans, and how will this impact your work for TDCJ?
Yeah, I think it's important to note along the lines of what Dr. Mulvey says, that soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, those who've served since the start of the all-volunteer force in the 1970s represent this huge cultural capital that the United States has, right? These are people who, raised their hand and said, my country needs young people to do something. I might die. I'm going to be away from my family and friends. I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff I don't enjoy, but I'm going to do it because it's my civic duty. I think it's a myth that people join up for free college. And if they do, that typically changes to martial brotherhood really quick. I tell people I joined up so I could get my undergraduate paid for. I went back for the next 12 years because of the men and women who I was serving beside. So considering that, I think not just as a veteran, but society writ large, right? We have a debt to pay to these young people who have served and continue to serve. And the best way to address that debt is to see what problems afflict them the most or are potentially the most serious. And I'm a risk benefit guy. So how can we address those problems in a way that helps improve or maintain the cultural capital of the United States? The fact of the matter is, probably the two largest issues in the veterans population right now, if you were to ask me or most veterans, are criminal justice involvement and suicidality. And so these are the two key areas that my own research will continue to focus on in the future. I was lucky enough to be able to capture a really cool novel data set for my dissertation, which looks at everything from offending to arrests to suicidal ideation among veterans. I plan on capitalizing on that and expanding that to a more rigorously designed study with hopefully an even more representative national sample in the future. And a lot of the work I plan on doing is using different forms of modeling among veterans. And the work I plan on doing in the future is specifically going to be examining kind of these ideological factors for offending among veterans or criminal justice involvement and suicide, as well as the downstream effects and consequences of these actions and behaviors. Now, as far as my work with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice goes, they are very supportive of the external research and work I do on the outside. But there's a unique opportunity there, right? As it stands, just like every other state in the US, Texas has a not unsubstantial veteran population within our prisons. Now, unlike some states, we do have a number of programmings and policies which are designed to specifically target and aid our veterans as they acclimate from the prison total institution back into the free world. And so the correctional agency is a big ship. Sometimes it takes a while to steer. And one of the best ways to make that ship responsive to steering is program evaluation and determining, hey, are we doing things right? Are these helping people? Because we do have to justify our programs to the state legislature who are cutting our checks, right? And so I imagine a lot of my future research with TDCJ will not only be finding new novel ways to deliver programs and services incarcerated veterans are deeply in need of, but also to evaluate those existing programs to make sure they're effective and that they're hitting these benchmarks. And that can range from recidivism to getting in trouble while you're incarcerated on the inside, or even improving familial relations, right? These are all benchmarks and metrics that are the stated goals of many of these programs that we can judge and evaluate. And so I imagine that's where a lot of my agency research on veterans will focus.
We would like to thank Dr. Phil Mulvey and Dr. Wesley Smith for taking the time to discuss veterans and mental health with us. We hope that this information will help others by raising awareness. Thank you for taking the time to watch and or listen to our CVI Talks presentation. Stay tuned for future CVI Talks. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for the latest and greatest concerning CVI.